The fluorescent lights buzzed above Anne's head like dying insects as she pressed her trembling hand against the consent form, her signature barely recognizable as human writing anymore. The plasma donation center reeked of desperation masked by cheap disinfectant, a smell that had become as familiar to her as breathing over these past months. Since Tom Hardy walked away from their marriage carrying everything they had built together while leaving her with. Nothing but the echo of his laughter and $40 worth of self-respect pooling in a plastic bag. She could still hear his voice from that final day in the courthouse parking lot. Could still see the cruel twist of his smile as he delivered his parting gift wrapped in mockery. "You'll die alone and broke, Anne. That's what happens to women like you who forget their place." The needle slid into her vein with a familiar sting that Anne barely registered anymore, her body too exhausted from survival to notice one more small violation. She watched her blood flow through clear tubing, dark and viscous, carrying pieces of who she used to be toward a machine that would determine its value in dollars and cents, the only currency that seemed to matter in a world that had chewed her up and spit her out like bad meat. Anne had loved Tom Hardy with a desperation that frightened her when she allowed herself to remember it clearly. Back when she was working double shifts at the diner with feet that screamed and a back that felt like it might snap in half. Living with two roommates who treated her belongings like community property and her privacy like a suggestion. She had grown up in foster care, shuffled between families who collected checks but never collected children, never knowing her real parents or why she had been discarded like trash someone forgot to take out. And that foundational abandonment had carved out a hollow place inside her that Tom seemed to fill completely when he first walked through the diner doors. He had ordered coffee and apple pie, left a tip bigger than the bill itself, and returned every single day for 2 weeks until she finally agreed to let him drive her home. Tom was all broad shoulders and easy confidence then, working construction with hands that knew how to build things. And when he promised to build a life with her, she believed him with every fractured piece of her desperate heart. Their wedding happened at the courthouse, with strangers pulled from the hallway to serve as witnesses. Anne wearing a dress from the thrift store that still had someone else's perfume clinging to the fabric, and Tom in the same clothes he wore to job sites. And she had convinced herself this was romance, this was real, this was the beginning of forever, in all its messy, imperfect glory. She worked herself into exhaustion, helping launch his construction business, contributing every paycheck, eating meals that came from boxes and cans, sleeping 4 hours a night so she could work more shifts and bring home more money to fuel their shared dream. When success finally arrived, when the contracts got bigger and the bank account grew fatter and the future looked bright enough to hurt her eyes, Tom looked at her differently, like she was a stain on expensive furniture, a reminder of poverty he desperately wanted to forget. She found the text messages by accident, conversations with Rebecca who worked at his lawyer's office, a blonde woman with a trust fund, and parents who belonged to country clubs. And the messages were full of plans that did not include Anne. Discussions about restaurants, where entrees cost more than Anne's weekly grocery budget, and vacation destinations she could not find on a map. When Anne confronted him with shaking hands and tears streaming down her face, Tom had not even bothered lying. He simply shrugged and told her he had evolved past her, that she represented everything he was trying to leave behind. And could she please sign the divorce papers quickly, because Rebecca was waiting and he had dinner reservations to keep. The divorce lawyer destroyed her systematically, and Anne signed papers she barely understood because she could not afford representation and Tom could afford the best. She walked away from their marriage with clothes in garbage bags and a used car that died 2 weeks later, while Tom kept the house and the furniture and the business they had built with her sweat and his ambition. And his final words followed her into nightmares she could not escape. Anne's spiraling thoughts crashed to a halt when the nurse gasped sharply, her face draining of color so fast it looked like someone pulled a plug. The nurse stared at the machine screen with widening eyes. her hands beginning to shake as she fumbled with controls that suddenly seemed to confuse her. "Don't move," the nurse whispered urgently, stopping the blood flow with shaking fingers. "Please don't move at all. I need to call someone immediately." Fear shot through Anne's body like electricity. "What's happening? What's wrong with my blood?" But the nurse was already running from the room, moving with barely controlled panic, leaving Anne alone with the needle still embedded in her arm and terror climbing her throat like bile. Anne's mind raced through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Diseases with names she could not pronounce, infections eating her from the inside, cancers spreading through her blood while she sold it for grocery money. Her body betraying her just like Tom betrayed her, just like her birth parents betrayed her, just like everyone who ever touched her life betrayed her eventually. The minutes crawled past like wounded animals, each second stretching into infinity while Anne counted heartbeats and tried not to scream. She thought about Tom living his perfect life with Rebecca, thought about dying alone in this awful place that smelled like failure, thought about how her entire existence had been nothing but a series of abandonments leading to this final cosmic joke, where even her own blood turned against her. 20 minutes felt like 20 years before the door finally opened and 3 men walked in wearing suits that probably cost more than Anne made in 6 months back when she still had a job. They moved with quiet authority, their expressions serious but not unkind, and the tallest one approached her chair with measured steps that seemed carefully calculated not to frighten her further. "Miss Anne," he said softly, his voice carrying warmth despite the intensity in his dark eyes. "My name is James, and I work for a family who has been searching for someone very specific for many years. The blood screening you just underwent revealed something extraordinary." Anne's voice came out as barely a whisper. Am I dying?" "No," James said quickly, and something that might have been excitement flickered across his face. "You're not dying. You're about to start living in ways you never imagined possible. Your blood contains genetic markers so rare that only a handful of people in this entire country share them, and those markers match perfectly with a woman named Josephine Thornton." The name meant nothing to Anne, just syllables strung together without context or meaning. "I don't understand what you're saying." James pulled out a leather folder and opened it carefully, revealing photographs that made Anne's breath catch painfully in her chest. The woman in the pictures looked exactly like her. Same bone structure, same eyes, same small scar above the left eyebrow that Anne had carried her whole life without knowing where it came from. The woman was older, elegant, dressed in clothes that screamed wealth and power. But the resemblance was so striking, it felt like looking into a mirror that showed the future instead of the present. "This is Josephine Thornton," James continued gently. "She owns the Thornton Media Empire, one of the most successful black-owned businesses in the country. 32 years ago, her newborn daughter was stolen from the hospital nursery and never recovered, despite every resource imaginable being devoted to the search. That daughter was you, Anne. You were taken, not abandoned. You were desperately wanted, not thrown away. Your mother has been looking for you since the day you vanished." The words hit Anne like physical blows, each syllable carrying impossible weight that crushed her chest and stole her breath. She had spent her entire life believing she was unwanted, that whoever gave birth to her took one look and decided she was not worth keeping, and that belief had shaped everything, had made her accept crumbs from Tom because she thought crumbs were all she deserved, had made her tolerate abuse because she assumed being chosen at all was more than someone like her should expect. "That's impossible," Anne whispered, but even as she spoke, the denial she could see the truth staring back at her from the photographs. "I grew up in foster care. Nobody wanted me. Nobody came looking." "Someone did come looking," James said firmly. "Josephine Thornton never stopped looking. She donated blood monthly to facilities across the country, setting up a system to flag these specific genetic markers. hoping that one day her daughter would need plasma or blood or some medical intervention that would reveal the connection. Today, that hope became reality. Today, we found you. Anne's hands shook so violently, the chair rattled beneath her. Why should I believe any of this? Why should I trust you? James nodded as though he expected the question. We're taking you to the hospital right now for comprehensive DNA testing. You'll have independent doctors verify everything we're telling you. But Anne, I need you to understand something crucial. Your mother has been waiting 32 years for this moment. She has never given up hope. She has never stopped searching. And when she sees you, when she holds you, she's going to cry tears she's been saving for 3 decades. They drove her to a private hospital, where doctors drew vials of blood and asked questions about her medical history that Anne answered mechanically, her mind unable to fully process what was happening. The tests took hours, and James waited patiently in the hallway, making quiet phone calls while Anne sat in the examination room trying to reconcile the person she thought she was with, the person these strangers claimed she might be. When the doctor finally returned with results, his expression was gentle but certain. The DNA evidence is conclusive. You are Josephine Thornton's biological daughter. There is no doubt whatsoever. Anne felt the world tilt sideways, felt everything she thought she knew about herself crumble into dust. Where is she? Where is this woman who's supposed to be my mother? She's waiting at the family estate, James said quietly. She's been waiting there since we called her 3 hours ago. She hasn't moved from the front steps because she's afraid if she goes inside, she'll miss the moment you arrive. Are you ready to meet her? Anne wanted to say no, wanted to run away from this impossible situation and return to the familiar misery of her small apartment and her unpaid bills and her simple, uncomplicated suffering. But something deeper than fear or logic pulled her forward. Some cellular recognition that whispered this was real, this was true, this was the answer to questions she had carried her whole life without knowing how to ask them properly. The drive to the Thornton estate took them through neighborhoods that got progressively wealthier until they turned onto a private road lined with trees that looked older than time itself. When the mansion came into view, Anne actually gasped, unable to comprehend that buildings this large existed outside of movies, unable to imagine that anyone really lived in houses, with wings and gardens and fountains that probably cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. A woman stood on the front steps, and even from a distance Anne could see her trembling. As the car got closer, the resemblance became undeniable. This elegant woman in her 50s with silver threading through her natural hair was an older version of Anne's own face. And when their eyes met through the car window, something passed between them that had no name, recognition that went deeper than sight or sound, or any sense that could be articulated with words. The car stopped, and Anne climbed out on legs that barely held her weight. Josephine Thornton stood frozen for one endless moment, her hand pressed against her mouth, tears already streaming down her face. And then she moved forward with a sound that was half sob and half prayer, pulling Anne into her arms with desperate strength. "My baby," Josephine whispered against Anne's hair, her whole body shaking with the force of her crying. "My baby girl. I never stopped looking. I never stopped believing. You're home now. You're finally home." Anne stood rigid in her mother's embrace, unable to move, unable to cry, unable to do anything but feel the terrible weight of 3 decades of abandonment being rewritten into 3 decades of desperate searching. And she did not know which truth was harder to bear, the old lie or the new reality that meant everything she believed about herself was wrong. Chapter 2. The Ghost in the Mirror. Morning light filtered through curtains that probably cost more than Anne's yearly rent back when she still had rent to pay. And she woke disoriented in a bed so soft it felt like floating on clouds made of money. The guest room, where they had placed her last night, was larger than her entire previous apartment, decorated with art that belonged in museums and furniture that looked too expensive to actually use. And Anne lay there staring at the ornate ceiling, trying to convince herself this was real, and not some elaborate dream her desperate mind had constructed to escape the nightmare her life had become. Her phone buzzed with another missed call from the bill collectors, who did not know or care that her entire identity had just been shattered and rebuilt in a single afternoon. Anne silenced it and forced herself out of bed, her reflection in the floor-length mirror showing a woman who looked exhausted and overwhelmed. Still wearing the cheap clothes she had donated plasma in yesterday, still carrying the weight of poverty in her shoulders and the fear of abandonment in her eyes. A soft knock preceded Josephine entering with a breakfast tray, her face bright with a hope that made Anne's chest ache. "I thought you might be hungry. I didn't know what you liked, so I had the chef prepare several options." Anne stared at the tray, loaded with food, more food than she normally ate in 3 days, and felt her stomach turn over. "You have a chef. We have a chef," Josephine corrected gently. "This is your home now, Anne. Everything here belongs to you as much as it belongs to me. You're my daughter, my heir, my family." The words felt like stones dropping into deep water, sinking into places Anne could not reach. She had spent 31 years believing she was nobody's daughter, nobody's family, just a foster kid who aged out of the system and barely survived on the margins of a world that did not want her. And now this stranger was claiming her with an intensity that felt suffocating, despite its obvious sincerity. "I need you to understand something," Anne said slowly, her voice rough from suppressed emotion. "I don't know how to be your daughter. I don't know how to live in a place like this. I don't even know how to believe this is real and not just another cruel joke the universe is playing on me." Josephine's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I know this is overwhelming. I know you've been hurt in ways I can't fully comprehend. But Anne, I need you to know that losing you destroyed me. Every birthday I celebrated for you without you there. Every Christmas I bought presents for a little girl who never came home. Every night I lay awake wondering if you were safe or scared or suffering. I've spent 32 years in a special kind of hell, and now that you're here, I'm terrified I'll do something wrong and you'll disappear again." The raw vulnerability in Josephine's voice cracked something inside Anne's carefully constructed defenses. "I won't disappear. I just need time to adjust to a world where I matter to someone, where I'm not disposable, where people don't walk away the moment I become inconvenient." "Someone hurt you deeply," Josephine said quietly. "Someone made you believe you were disposable." Anne's jaw tightened. "His name was Tom Hardy. We were married for 12 years. He left me with nothing and told me I would die alone and broke. And until yesterday I believed him because why wouldn't I? Everyone leaves eventually. That's what I learned in every foster home, every temporary placement, every situation where I started to feel safe before being moved somewhere else. Leaving is what people do. I didn't leave you," Josephine said fiercely. "You were stolen from me. There's a difference between abandonment and abduction, between choice and crime. And I need you to understand that I have fought for you every single day since you vanished from that hospital nursery." Before Anne could respond, the door opened and a man walked in, younger than Josephine, dressed casually but expensively, his expression guarded and his body language radiating tension. He looked at Anne with undisguised suspicion, his eyes cataloguing her cheap clothes and her obvious discomfort. And she could practically see him calculating what her sudden appearance meant for his own position in this family. "Lawrence," Josephine said warmly, "this is your sister Anne. Anne, this is Lawrence, my son. Half-sister," Lawrence corrected coolly. "Let's be accurate about the relationships here." He turned his attention to Anne fully. "So you're the missing daughter. Convenient timing, showing up just when DNA tests make these kinds of claims provable. Tell me, how long did you plan this? How did you know to target the plasma center?" "Lawrence!" Josephine snapped, her voice sharp with warning. "That's enough," but Anne held up her hand. "No, let him speak. He's suspicious of me. He thinks I'm running some kind of con. And honestly, that makes more sense to me than anything else right now. I didn't plan anything. I was broke and desperate and selling my blood to avoid eviction, and now I'm supposedly the heir to a fortune I didn't know existed. I understand his skepticism because I feel it too. Lawrence's expression shifted slightly, surprise flickering across his features. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone more polished. Someone who seemed comfortable claiming what isn't hers. Nothing about this is comfortable, Anne said flatly. And I'm not claiming anything. I'm just trying to survive, same as I've always done. Except now I'm surviving in a house that feels like a museum and wearing clothes that smell like poverty while everyone around me pretends not to notice. Josephine set the breakfast tray down with more force than necessary. Anne, we're going shopping today. I'm going to buy you a complete new wardrobe, and before you argue, understand that this isn't charity. This is a mother dressing her daughter, something I've dreamed of doing for 32 years. Shopping meant driving to stores Anne had only seen from the outside, stores where the staff greeted them by name and brought champagne, while Anne tried on clothes that cost more per item than she used to earn in a month. Josephine watched with undisguised joy as Anne modeled dresses and suits and casual wear, buying everything Anne even glanced at twice. And while part of Anne wanted to resist the excess, another part of her, the part that had eaten ramen noodles for dinner and worn shoes with holes in the soles, and pretended she was not hungry when food was too expensive, wanted to sink into this luxury and never surface. They returned to the mansion with more shopping bags than Anne could count, and Josephine insisted on a family dinner that evening to introduce Anne to extended relatives who had heard about the miraculous reunion and wanted to meet the lost daughter who had finally come home. Anne dressed in one of the new outfits, a deep blue dress that fit perfectly and probably cost enough to have paid her rent for 3 months. And when she looked in the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Dinner was overwhelming. A table full of cousins and aunts and uncles who asked questions Anne did not know how to answer about her childhood and her life and her plans for the future. She answered carefully, revealing as little as possible, protecting herself from these strangers who shared her blood but not her history. And through it all, she felt Lawrence watching her with an expression she could not quite read. Suspicion mixed with something that might have been grudging respect. After the relatives left, Anne escaped to the mansion's library, needing quiet and solitude after hours of performing normalcy she did not feel. She found herself staring at her reflection in a darkened window, seeing the expensive dress and the styled hair and the woman who looked like she belonged in this world. And underneath it all, she still saw the foster kid who never had enough, the ex-wife who was not enough, the woman Tom Hardy threw away like garbage. "You're thinking about him," Lawrence said from the doorway, making Anne jump. "Whoever he is, you're thinking about the person who hurt you." Anne turned to face her half-brother. "His name is Tom Hardy. He's my ex-husband. He divorced me, took everything and told me I was worthless. Yesterday I believed him. Today I'm supposedly worth billions. The math doesn't add up." "The math always adds up," Lawrence said, moving into the room. "Your worth isn't defined by his assessment. It never was. But I understand the feeling. When you've been told you're nothing for long enough, believing you're something feels like a lie." "Why are you being nice to me now?" "Because I've spent the day watching you, and you're genuinely uncomfortable with all of this. You're not performing gratitude or acting entitled. You're just surviving, same as you said this morning, and I respect that more than I respect people who were born into wealth and act like they earned it." Lawrence paused. "I was wrong to be hostile. You didn't ask for this either." Anne felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be someone's daughter when I've spent my whole life being nobody's anything." "Then start small," Lawrence suggested. "Be someone who lives here. Be someone who belongs here. The daughter part will come eventually, or maybe it won't, but either way you're family now, whether you like it or not." That night, Anne lay in the expensive bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind circling back to Tom Hardy like a wound she could not stop touching. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether he ever thought about her, or whether she had been so thoroughly erased from his mind that she might as well have never existed. Part of her wanted him to know about this reversal of fortune, wanted him to see her living in this mansion and wearing these clothes and being someone important, wanted to watch his face when he realized what he had thrown away. But a deeper part of her, the part that still carried the scars of loving him, knew that even this fortune could not fill the hole he had carved in her sense of self-worth. Money could not heal abandonment. Wealth could not erase the feeling of being disposable. And until she figured out how to believe she deserved love, regardless of her bank account balance, she would remain trapped in the ghost story of who she used to be, haunting the halls of a mansion she was too damaged to call home. Chapter 3. The Daughters She Raised in Silence. 6 weeks passed in a blur of adjustment and disorientation, and Anne slowly began to accept that this new reality was not going to evaporate like morning mist. She learned the rhythms of the household, met with lawyers who explained trust funds and inheritance structures she barely understood, and spent awkward but increasingly comfortable evenings with Josephine, who seemed content just to sit in the same room and know her daughter was real and present and safe. Lawrence had softened considerably, sometimes even seeking Anne out for conversation, and while they were not close, there was a tentative understanding growing between them. Siblings learning to navigate shared space after a lifetime of being only children. But through it all, Anne carried a secret that pressed against her chest like a stone she could not dislodge. A truth she had not spoken to anyone in this new family, because speaking it would make it real in ways she was not ready to handle. That morning, standing in the marble bathroom of her guest suite, turned permanent bedroom, Anne finally called the number she had been avoiding, her hands shaking as she dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered, sharp and suspicious. "Mom, where have you been? We've been calling you for 6 weeks. We thought you were dead." Anne's throat closed around tears she had been suppressing. "Delilah, I'm so sorry. I should have called sooner." "Sorry? You disappear completely. Stop answering texts, and now you're sorry." Delilah's anger was righteous and justified. "Ivy has been crying every night, thinking something terrible happened to you. What the hell is going on?" "You know, something did happen," Anne said slowly. "Something impossible. I need you and Ivy to come to an address I'm going to send you. I need to explain everything in person because you won't believe it otherwise. Are you in trouble? Do you need money?" The question made Anne laugh, a broken sound that hurt coming out. "No, baby, I'm not in trouble. Just come, please, both of you." She sent the address and spent the next 2 hours pacing her room, rehearsing words that never sounded right. "How did you tell your daughters that everything they knew about their mother's life was only a fragment of a larger story? How did you explain that the woman who raised them in poverty, who worked 3 jobs and went without meals so they could eat, was actually the stolen heir to a media empire worth billions?" When the security guard called to announce visitors, Anne raced downstairs, her heart pounding. Josephine watched from the library doorway with curiosity, Lawrence appearing behind her, both of them recognizing that something significant was happening, even if they did not understand what. Anne opened the front door herself, and there they stood, her daughters, her beautiful, brilliant daughters who carried her heart outside her body. Delilah, fierce and sharp-edged in a business suit despite it being the weekend, her natural hair cut close to her skull, her eyes blazing with questions and concern. Ivy, softer but no less strong, wearing flowing clothes and carrying worry in the tension of her shoulders, her locks pulled back with a colorful scarf. They both froze when they saw the mansion behind Anne, their expressions shifting from concern to confusion to something approaching shock. Delilah recovered first, her lawyer's mind already cataloguing details and forming theories. "Mum, what is this place? Whose house is this?" "Mine," Anne said, and the word felt foreign in her mouth. or it is now. It's a long story. Come inside, please." They entered slowly, taking in the opulence with wide eyes. And when Josephine stepped forward from the library, Delilah actually gasped because the resemblance was undeniable. 3 generations of women wearing the same face with slight variations. Anne made introductions with shaking hands. "Josephine, Lawrence, these are my daughters, Delilah and Ivy. They're twins. They're 31. She turned to her daughters, her voice breaking. "Girls, this is Josephine Thornton. She's my biological mother. I was stolen from her as a baby. She found me 6 weeks ago through a blood test at a plasma donation center." The silence that followed was deafening. Delilah and Ivy stared at their mother, at their grandmother they did not know existed, at the mansion and the wealth and the impossible story unfolding in front of them. Ivy spoke first, her voice small and uncertain. "You were donating plasma? Mom, why didn't you tell us things were that bad?" Because you both struggle enough without worrying about me," Anne said. "Because I'm supposed to be the parent who has everything under control, not the disaster who can't keep her life together. Except now you're a billionaire." Delilah's voice carried disbelief. "This is insane. This is actually insane." Josephine stepped forward carefully. "Your mother grew up believing she was abandoned, when in reality she was stolen from me as a newborn. I've spent 32 years searching for her. And now I discover I'm not just getting my daughter back, I'm getting granddaughters too. Beautiful, brilliant granddaughters who clearly got the best of both sides of their family." The words broke something in Ivy, and she started crying, which set Anne off. And suddenly all 3 women were sobbing, while Delilah stood rigid. Her lawyer's training, keeping her emotions locked down, even as tears leaked from her eyes despite her best efforts. Lawrence retreated tactfully, giving them privacy, and Josephine guided them all to the library couches where they sat close together, years of separation dissolving in the shared weight of this impossible reunion. Hours passed in explanation and storytelling, and told them about Tom Hardy's divorce, about the poverty she had been hiding from them, about the desperation that led her to the plasma center. Josephine told them about the stolen baby, the decades of searching, the genetic markers that finally brought her daughter home. And slowly, carefully, Anne revealed the secret she had carried for 31 years. The truth she had never spoken, because speaking it would give Tom Hardy power over the most precious things in her life. "Your father," Anne began, and both girls went still. "His name is Tom Hardy. He's the man who divorced me when you were born, except he divorced me before I knew I was pregnant. We were married 12 years. I loved him completely. He left me for another woman and took everything, and I found out about you 2 weeks after he was gone." Delilah's voice was ice. "Did you tell him?" "I tried," Anne said quietly. "I sent letters to his business address, to his new apartment. They all came back unopened. I called his phone and he never answered. After a month, I stopped trying because it was clear he wanted nothing to do with me, and I decided that a man who abandoned me so completely didn't deserve to know about you. I raised you alone, because being alone was better than chasing someone who made it crystal clear I was disposable." "Good," Delilah said fiercely. "He doesn't deserve us. He never deserved you." Ivy was quieter, processing. "Does he know now? With all the media coverage about you being found, does he know you're wealthy?" "I don't know what he knows," Anne admitted. "I've been hiding here trying to figure out who I am now that everything I believed about myself was wrong." Josephine watched this exchange with increasing understanding. "These girls are Tom Hardy's biological children, but he never knew they existed." "He never wanted to know," Anne corrected. "There's a difference. He made himself unreachable, made it clear he wanted no contact, wanted no reminders of the life he was leaving behind. I was that life. They would have been too." "Screw him," Delilah said bluntly. "We had you, and you were worth 10 of whoever he is. You worked yourself into exhaustion for us. You gave us everything. You loved us enough that we never felt the absence of a father because your love took up all the space." Anne pulled both daughters close, breathing in their familiar scents, feeling the weight of 3 decades of sacrifice and love and determination settling into something that felt almost like peace. They were here, they were hers, and Tom Hardy's absence from their lives was his loss, not theirs. Josephine stood and moved to sit beside her newly discovered family. "You're all welcome here for as long as you want. This is your home now, too. All of you. Family takes care of family, and I have 31 years of grandmother duties to catch up on." That evening they gathered for dinner, and Anne watched her daughters interact with Josephine and Lawrence. Watch them slowly relax into the unfamiliar luxury. Watch them claim space in this mansion, the same way they had claimed space in every tiny apartment Anne had ever rented. They stayed the night in guest rooms that made their own apartments look like closets. And in the morning over breakfast, Delilah asked the question that had been building since the previous afternoon. What happens if he finds out? What happens if Tom Hardy discovers not only that you're wealthy now, but that he has daughters he never knew about? Anne's hand tightened around her coffee cup. Then we deal with it. But he doesn't get to claim you. He doesn't get to show up 3 decades late and pretend biology trumps everything. You're mine. You've always been mine. And no amount of DNA is going to change that. Ivy reached across the table and squeezed Anne's hand. We're not going anywhere, Mom. We've survived poverty. We've survived your struggle with a broken heart. We've survived everything life threw at us together. Some random sperm donor doesn't get to change that now. But even as they spoke brave words, Anne felt dread settling into her bones like winter cold. Tom Hardy was out there somewhere, living his life, and if he discovered what she had, if he learned about Delilah and Ivy, she knew with terrible certainty that he would not stay away. Men like Tom Hardy did not ignore opportunities, especially opportunities wrapped in inheritance and blood ties and legal claims to generational wealth. And Anne was right to be afraid, because 3 states away, Tom Hardy was watching the news coverage of the Thornton family's miraculous reunion, and in the background of one photograph, barely visible but unmistakable, were 2 young women who looked enough like him that his blood ran cold with recognition and possibility. Chapter 4. The Ruins of a Man. Tom Hardy stared at his television screen until his eyes burned. Remote control forgotten in his hand as the local news ran yet another human interest story about the Thornton family reunion. The anchor spoke with manufactured emotion about miracles and modern technology, about a stolen baby found after 32 years through a routine plasma donation. And Tom barely heard the words because all his attention was locked on the woman standing beside Josephine Thornton on those mansion steps. The woman who looked hauntingly familiar despite her expensive clothes and styled hair. Anne, his ex-wife Anne, the woman he had divorced with such casual cruelty, the woman he had told would die alone and broke, was apparently the missing Thornton heir, and now worth more money than Tom would see in 10 lifetimes, even if he lived forever. The remote slipped from his fingers as his whole body went numb with shock. He had destroyed her so completely, had taken everything in the divorce and laughed about it. And now she was standing in front of a mansion that probably had more bathrooms than their entire neighborhood used to have houses. The unfairness of it hit him like a physical blow. Rage and disbelief, and something that might have been regret if he had been capable of that particular emotion. But it was the next image that stopped his heart entirely. The camera panned to show 2 younger women standing slightly behind Anne, and Tom's breath caught because he recognized his own features reflected in their faces, his nose on one, his chin on the other, his eyes looking back at him from strangers who could not possibly be strangers because genetics did not lie, and resemblance this strong meant only one thing. He had daughters. Anne had been pregnant when he left her, and she had never told him. And now those daughters were grown women standing in front of a fortune that was technically their inheritance too. And Tom's mind immediately started calculating angles and opportunities and ways to turn this cosmic joke into his own advantage. His apartment, a shabby one-bedroom in a building that smelled like old cooking and broken dreams, suddenly felt even more pathetic than usual. Tom looked around at the peeling paint and the furniture he had pulled from dumpsters, and the life he had somehow ended up living despite all his success just a few years ago. The construction business had collapsed spectacularly. Contracts drying up during an economic downturn, debts piling up faster than he could manage them, and Rebecca had left him the moment the money disappeared, taking half of what remained and making it clear she had married potential, not the man himself. Tom grabbed his phone and started researching, pulling up everything he could find about Anne's discovery, about the Thornton family, about the legal implications of paternity and inheritance rights. The internet gave him fragments and pieces, enough to understand that Anne was now part of a billion-dollar empire, enough to see photographs of his daughters looking successful and educated and completely beyond his reach. He found Delilah first, a civil rights attorney with a growing reputation and a social media presence that radiated competence and fierceness. Then Ivy, an artist and music teacher whose work appeared in local galleries and whose students clearly adored her. Both of them successful despite growing up in poverty. Both of them bearing his genes but Anne's influence. Both of them living proof that he had walked away from something valuable and never even known it existed. The math was simple, even for someone as desperate as Tom had become. Those girls were his biological daughters. They were inheriting from the Thornton empire. He was their father. There had to be some angle, some legal claim, some way to insert himself into this situation and extract value from genes he had contributed, even if he had contributed nothing else. Tom spent 3 days researching lawyers, making calls he could barely afford, trying to determine what rights he might have. The answers were uniformly discouraging. He had no legal claim to Anne's inheritance because they were divorced, and he had signed papers relinquishing all future claims to anything she acquired. His daughters were adults who could choose whether or not to have contact with him. Without their consent, he had no automatic right to access them or their money. Biology was not enough. Courts would laugh him out of the building. But Tom Hardy had not survived construction work and business failures and Rebecca's departure by giving up when things looked impossible. He had survived by being persistent, by finding angles other people missed, by pushing until something gave way. And Anne was the weak point here because Anne had loved him once. And people who loved you always had soft spots that could be exploited if you knew where to press. He showed up at the Thornton estate gates 3 weeks after seeing the news coverage, wearing the best suit he still owned, even though it was years out of style and did not quite fit anymore. The security guard looked at him with undisguised skepticism when Tom announced he was there to see Anne, and after a tense phone conversation that Tom could not hear, the guard informed him that Miss Anne was not receiving visitors and he should leave the property. Tom returned the next week, and the week after that, each time being turned away, but making sure his visits were logged, making sure there was a record of his attempts at contact. He sent letters that he suspected were never delivered, left voicemails on numbers he found through internet searches that were probably disconnected or ignored. He was building a case of attempted reconciliation, creating a paper trail that might be useful later if this ever ended up in court. His break came through Lawrence Thornton's private investigator, who Tom managed to intercept at a coffee shop through a combination of research and dumb luck. Tom bought the man a drink and told him a sob story about being Anne's ex-husband, about wanting to apologize for past mistakes, about hoping for closure, and the investigator, perhaps feeling sympathetic or perhaps just bored, mentioned that Anne had been invited to a charity gala at the mansion the following month. Tom spent his last bit of money on a tuxedo rental and crashed the gala, slipping in with a group of late arrivals, and for the first time in months, he felt like himself again. surrounded by wealth and pretending he belonged there. He accepted champagne from passing waiters and made small talk with donors who assumed he was someone important. And through it all, he kept his eyes locked on Anne, this woman he had discarded, who now glowed with confidence he had never seen before. She was breathtaking in a way he did not remember, wearing a dress that probably cost more than his monthly rent, her natural hair styled elaborately, her laugh genuine as she spoke with guests who clearly adored her. Tom felt something twist in his chest, not quite regret, but close to it. The recognition that he had thrown away something valuable before understanding its worth. And then he saw them, his daughters, moving through the crowd with a kind of easy grace that spoke to quality education and comfortable upbringings despite the poverty Anne must have survived to give them those things. One of them was intense and sharp, watching everyone with assessing eyes, while the other was softer but no less observant. And Tom's heart raced because they were his biology, his legacy, his potential ticket back to relevance. Lawrence introduced him to the intense one, Delilah, mentioning she was Anne's daughter, and Tom shook her hand while his mind raced. He asked polite questions about her work, complimented her obvious intelligence, and felt her watching him with an attention that suggested she saw more than he wanted to reveal. She excused herself quickly, and Tom felt rather than saw Anne watching from across the room. Later, the softer one approached him, introducing herself as Ivy, and Tom turned on the charm he had once used on Anne, complimenting her art, her work with children, her obvious talent. She smiled, but her smile did not reach her eyes, and when she asked if he had children of his own, Tom answered honestly without understanding the trap. "No, I never had kids. Never met the right person to have them with." He watched something flicker across her face, disappointment maybe, or vindication, and she excused herself politely before disappearing into the crowd. Tom stood alone with his champagne, and across the room Anne stared at him with an expression he could not read, triumph mixed with something that looked almost like pity, and he realized he had just failed some test he had not known he was taking. Chapter 5. The Night He Forgot. Anne invited Tom to the mansion 5 days after the gala, having him brought in a Thornton car like a prisoner being escorted to trial. And Tom tried to maintain his composure during the drive. Even though his hands shook with nerves, he refused to acknowledge. The driver said nothing, offered nothing, just deposited Tom at the front entrance and drove away, leaving him to face the massive doors alone. A staff member led him through halls that seemed designed to make visitors feel small, past art that belonged in museums and furniture that whispered old money and permanence, until finally they reached a library where Anne sat waiting with Josephine and Lawrence, flanking her like judges at a sentencing hearing. Tom's mouth went dry when he saw Anne up close for the first time since the divorce. Saw the woman he had destroyed sitting in a position of absolute power while he stood before her with nothing. "Sit down." "Tom," Anne said, her voice flat and emotionless. She gestured to a chair positioned directly across from her, close enough that he could see every detail of her face, far enough that he could not reach her even if he tried. Tom sat and tried to look confident, but everything about this room and this situation was designed to strip him of that particular delusion. Anne studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes cataloguing every detail of his decline, the weight he had lost, the grey in his hair, the cheap suit he was trying to pass off as acceptable. When she finally spoke, her words came slow and deliberate, each one landing like a small blade, finding vulnerable flesh. "Do you remember our last night together, Tom? The night before you left me?" Tom's mind scrambled to retrieve the memory she was asking for, but that entire period was a blur of planning his exit and anticipating his future with Rebecca. He had been so focused on what came next that he had barely paid attention to what was happening in the present. "I remember things were difficult between us," he said carefully. "Things were difficult," Anne repeated, and something dangerous flickered in her expression. That's how you described the night I cooked your favorite dinner, wore the dress you told me you loved, and tried desperately to remind you why you married me in the first place. That's difficult. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Anne, it was a long time ago. We were both unhappy. You were unhappy, she corrected sharply. I was terrified. I knew you were leaving, could feel you slipping away. And that night I gave you everything I had left to give. I made love to you like it was the last time, because I knew it was the last time. And I begged you without words to remember what we had, to choose me over whatever shiny new thing had caught your attention. The memory came back in fragments. Anne in red, Anne reaching for him with desperation he had found suffocating, and clinging to him after sex with a need that had made him feel trapped rather than loved. He had given her his body that night, but his mind was already with Rebecca, already planning his escape. And the guilt he had suppressed for years suddenly felt sharp and immediate. You left at dawn, Anne continued, her voice steady despite the emotion beneath it. You left divorce papers on the kitchen table and a note saying you had met someone who understood your ambitions better than I did. You told me not to contact you, that your lawyer would handle everything. And then you drove away, like our 12 years together were nothing more than an inconvenient phase you had finally outgrown. I was cruel, Tom admitted, because there was no point denying what they both knew was true. I was young and stupid, and I made terrible mistakes. Mistakes? Anne leaned forward, her voice dropping to something barely above a whisper, but somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. You destroyed me. You took everything we built and walked away laughing, and I was so broken afterward that I donated plasma for $40 just to avoid being homeless. That's not a mistake, Tom. That's malicious cruelty. Josephine spoke for the first time, her voice cold. You told my daughter she would die alone and broke. You laughed when you said it. That's not the behavior of someone who made mistakes. That's the behavior of someone who enjoyed causing pain. Tom wanted to defend himself, but the words would not come because Josephine was right, and they all knew it. He had enjoyed Anne's pain in a sick way, had felt powerful in her powerlessness, had needed her to be small so he could feel big. And that truth was too ugly to speak aloud. 2 weeks after you left me, Anne said quietly, I discovered I was pregnant. With twins, your daughters, Tom. Conceived on that last night when I was trying to save our marriage and you were already mentally gone. The words hit Tom like a physical blow, stealing his breath and his ability to think. Pregnant, twins, daughters. The pieces he had already suspected now confirmed with brutal certainty, and suddenly every calculation he had made, every angle he had planned, seemed pathetically transparent and doomed to failure. I tried to tell you, Anne continued relentlessly. I sent letters to your business address, to your apartment with Rebecca. You sent them all back unopened. I called your phone and you never answered. After a month, I stopped trying because you had made it abundantly clear that you wanted no contact, no reminders, no connection to the life you were leaving behind. So I raised them alone, Tom. I worked 3 jobs while pregnant. I gave birth to your daughters in a county hospital with no family beside me. I raised them in poverty while you built your business with money that should have supported them. Tom's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. The weight of what he had missed, what he had abandoned, pressed down on him like physical force. Delilah had pneumonia when she was 5, Anne said, her voice shaking now. I had to choose between medicine and rent. I chose medicine and we were evicted. We slept in my car for 2 weeks in January, while I worked enough hours to scrape together first month and deposit for a new place. Ivy needed glasses when she was 7, but glasses cost money we did not have, so she sat in the front row of every class, squinting at the board until a teacher noticed and the school paid for them. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Tom? Your daughters suffered poverty and hardship because you were too goddamn selfish to be bothered maintaining even the most basic level of contact with the woman you divorced. I didn't know, Tom whispered, and even to his own ears it sounded pathetic. You didn't want to know, Anne corrected fiercely. There's a critical difference between ignorance and willful blindness, and you chose blindness because it was convenient, because my pregnancy would have complicated your new life with Rebecca, because acknowledging that you had children would have required you to be responsible for something other than your own ambition. Tom looked at Josephine, at Lawrence, at Anne, and saw no sympathy in any of their faces, just cold judgment and the recognition that he had failed in every way a human being could fail. "Can I meet them?" he asked desperately. "Can I talk to my daughters?" "They're not your daughters," Anne said flatly. "They're mine. Biology is meaningless next to 31 years of love and sacrifice and showing up every single day. You're a sperm donor, Tom, nothing more. And if you think those girls want anything to do with you after learning what you did to me, you're even more delusional than I thought." Lawrence spoke for the first time, his voice carrying quiet menace. "You signed papers relinquishing all claims to anything Anne acquired post-divorce. You have no legal right to her inheritance. You have no automatic rights to contact with adult children who want nothing to do with you. You have nothing, Mr. Hardy. And if you attempt to force contact or make legal claims, I will personally ensure you're buried under so many lawsuits that bankruptcy will look like mercy." Tom felt panic rising in his chest. "I just want a chance to apologize, to explain, to try to make amends for the past." "Amends?" Anne's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You want to make amends now that there's a fortune involved? Where were your amends when I was struggling? Where was your desire to apologize when I was working myself to death, trying to feed your children? You don't want forgiveness, Tom. You want money. And you're not getting either from me." She stood, signaling the meeting was over, and Tom scrambled to his feet. "Anne, please, I know I was terrible. I know I don't deserve anything from you. But those are my daughters too, and I have a right to at least try to know them." Anne walked to the door, opened it, and gestured for him to leave. "You had 31 years of rights that you never exercised. You have no rights anymore. And if you come near my daughters, if you try to contact them or manipulate them or use them for your own purposes, I will make sure you regret it in ways that haunt you for whatever is left of your miserable life." Tom left the mansion feeling hollowed out, the security guard driving him back to the gates without a word. And as the estate disappeared behind him, he understood that he had lost something more valuable than money or success. He had lost any chance at redemption, any possibility of being more than the man who walked away from everything that mattered. And that realization hurt worse than any financial loss ever could. Chapter 6, The Father Who Never Knew. The text message from Lawrence arrived on Anne's phone 3 days after Tom's visit to the mansion, and its contents made her blood run cold despite the warm afternoon sun streaming through the library windows. Lawrence had discovered through his investigative team that Tom was researching Delilah and Ivy obsessively online, pulling up every social media profile, every published article, every photograph he could find, zooming in on their faces, comparing features, running timeline calculations between his divorce and their apparent ages. Anne called an emergency family meeting in the library, the same room where she had confronted Tom, because that space now felt like a courtroom where truth was excavated and consequences delivered. Josephine arrived first, her expression concerned when she saw Anne's face, followed by Lawrence carrying his tablet, loaded with evidence of Tom's digital stalking. Delilah and Ivy arrived last, both having rushed over from their respective apartments, and their worry was palpable when they saw their mother's distress. "He knows about you," Anne said without preamble, looking at her daughters. "Tom Hardy has figured out that you're his biological children, and according to Lawrence's investigators, he's been researching you obsessively for days. I think he's planning something, trying to figure out how to use your existence to his advantage. And I need to tell him the truth before he tries to approach you directly and control the narrative." Delilah's jaw tightened. "Let him try. I'm an attorney. I know my rights. He has no legal claim to us as adults, and I will bury him in paperwork if he attempts to harass us." "This isn't about legal rights," Anne said quietly. "This is about him potentially ambushing you somewhere public, crying about being denied his children, making you feel guilty for circumstances that were his fault, not yours. Tom is manipulative. That's what he does. He manipulates situations until he gets what he wants, and what he wants is access to your inheritance." Ivy spoke softly, always the gentler of the twins. "What do you want to do, Mom?" "I want to bring him back here tomorrow and tell him the truth with both of you present," Anne said. "I want him to see you, to meet you properly, and to understand with absolute clarity that you are not interested in any relationship with him. I want to rob him of the ability to play the victim, to claim he was kept from his daughters, by giving him exactly what he thinks he wants, and watching him realize it gains him nothing." Josephine placed a hand on Anne's shoulder. "Are you sure about this? Confronting him again so soon?" "I'm done protecting him from consequences," Anne said fiercely. "I'm done carrying this secret like it's my shame instead of his. He walked away from me pregnant and never looked back. He needs to face what that choice actually cost him. And my daughters need to see him for exactly what he is, so they're never tempted to romanticize the absent father or wonder what they missed." The next morning, Tom received a call from Lawrence's office, a formal invitation to return to the Thornton estate for a meeting with Anne and her daughters. Tom agreed immediately, his voice carrying poorly concealed excitement, and Anne felt disgust rise in her throat at how transparent his motivations were. He thought he was being offered an opportunity. He had no idea he was walking into his own reckoning. Anne dressed carefully in a deep purple suit that made her look like the powerful woman she was still learning to believe she could be. Delilah wore her courtroom armor, a sharp black ensemble that broadcast competence and no tolerance for manipulation. Ivy chose flowing artistic layers, comfortable and confident, and together they positioned themselves in the library like a united front. 3 generations of women who had survived Tom Hardy's absence and would not be diminished by his presence. When Tom was shown into the library, his face went through a rapid series of expressions as he took in the scene before him. And seated centrally, Delilah and Ivy standing on either side of her like warrior queens, protecting their mother, Josephine and Lawrence positioned nearby as witnesses and support. The resemblance between Tom and the twins was undeniable when they were all in the same room. His features echoed in their faces in ways that made biology impossible to deny. Tom's face went pale as the reality crashed over him. The calculations he had been making suddenly rendered irrelevant by the cold fury in 3 sets of eyes that looked at him like he was something unpleasant someone had tracked in on their shoes. "Sit down," Anne said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Tom sat. "These are my daughters," Anne continued, gesturing to Delilah and Ivy. "Delilah and Ivy, they were born 9 months after you divorced me, conceived on the last night we were together, raised entirely by me while you were busy building your business and living your new life with Rebecca. You met them at the gala last week. You shook their hands, complimented their work, and when Ivy asked if you had children, you said no, you never met the right person to have them with." Tom's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at his daughters, at these magnificent women who carried his genes, but none of his character, and something that might have been recognition or regret flickered across his face. Delilah stepped forward, her voice sharp and controlled. "Let me save you some time, Mr. Hardy. You're thinking about apologizing, about explaining that you didn't know, about trying to build some kind of relationship now that you've discovered we exist. Save your breath. We don't need a father. We never needed one because our mother was both parents, was everything we required, and she gave us a childhood full of love despite the poverty you condemned us to." "I didn't know you existed," Tom said desperately. "If I had known, I would have what?" Ivy interrupted, her soft voice carrying steel underneath. "Would have stayed with our mother, would have supported us financially, would have been present for our birthdays and our first days of school and the thousand small moments that make up a childhood. Don't insult us by claiming you would have been a decent father when you couldn't even be a decent husband. Anne spoke again, relentless. I want you to hear about the life your daughters lived because of your choice to walk away. Delilah, tell him about the pneumonia. Delilah's expression was cold. When I was 5, I had pneumonia. My fever hit 105 degrees. Mum had to choose between medicine and paying rent. She chose medicine, which meant we were evicted. We lived in her car for 2 weeks in January, me and Ivy wrapped in every piece of clothing we owned, sleeping in parking lots, using gas station bathrooms to wash up before Mom dropped us at school so nobody would know we were homeless. Tom's face crumbled. Anne, I'm so sorry. I had no idea things were that bad for you. Of course you had no idea, Anne said flatly. You never asked. You never checked. You never once wondered if the woman you divorced was surviving or suffering, because you were too busy living your best life to care about collateral damage. Ivy, Anne continued, tell him about the glasses. Ivy's voice shook slightly, but remained firm. When I was 7, I couldn't see the board in class. I needed glasses, but Mom couldn't afford them. I sat in the front row squinting until my head hurt every single day, until a teacher finally noticed and contacted the school nurse, and the school paid for my glasses through some assistance program because my mother was working 3 jobs and still qualified as low income. 3 jobs, Anne repeated. I worked 3 jobs, Tom. I cleaned offices at night, waited tables during breakfast and lunch shifts, and did data entry from home during Ivy and Delilah's nap times. I slept 4 hours a night for years. I gave blood for extra money. I went hungry so my daughters could eat. I wore clothes from donation bins so they could have new school uniforms. I sacrificed everything, and you know what the worst part was? I didn't even blame you. I blamed myself. I believed your words. From the courthouse parking lot, believed I was worthless, believed I deserved the suffering because if I had been enough, you would have stayed. And tears rolled down Tom's face now, and Anne felt nothing watching them fall. I was wrong, Tom whispered. I was so wrong about everything. You were enough. You were always enough. I was just too stupid and selfish to recognize what I had. No, you're right about that, Delilah said coldly. You were stupid and selfish, and you still are, showing up here now because you smell money. You don't want to apologize to Mom. You don't want to know us as people. You want access to the Thornton fortune, and you think biology gives you some claim to wealth you never earned and don't deserve. Oh, that's not true, Tom protested weakly. I just wanted a chance to know my daughters, to try to make up for lost time. Make up for lost time? Ivy laughed bitterly. You can't make up for 31 years. You can't retroactively attend the moments that mattered. You weren't there when I learned to play piano on a keyboard Mom bought at a yard sale. You weren't there when Delilah won her first debate competition. You weren't there for our high school graduations, or our college acceptances, or any of the 1,000 moments when having a father would have made a difference. You were absent by choice, and now you want credit for showing up? That's not how fatherhood works. Tom looked at Anne desperately. Please, I know I don't deserve anything from you, but they're my daughters too. Biology has to count for something. Biology counts for nothing, Anne said quietly. Fatherhood isn't about sperm donation, Tom. It's about showing up every single day. It's about sacrifice and love and putting your children's needs above your own comfort. It's about being present, even when being present is hard or expensive or inconvenient. You failed at all of those things before Delilah and Ivy were even born, and nothing you do now can change that. Lawrence stepped forward. This meeting is over. You've been given what you claimed to want, a chance to meet your biological children. Now you know they want nothing to do with you. and you need to respect that. If you attempt to contact them, if you show up at their homes or workplaces, if you try to use your biological connection to access the Thornton fortune or manipulate any situation involving this family, I will destroy you legally. Do you understand? Tom stood on shaking legs, looking at his daughters one last time, seeing no warmth or welcome in their faces, just ice-cold judgment and the door closing on any possibility of redemption. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry for everything." "Your apology means nothing," Delilah said. "Sorry doesn't pay rent or feed children or erase trauma. Sorry is just a word you're using now because you finally understand what you lost. Well, congratulations. Now you get to live with that knowledge forever." Tom left the mansion broken, and Anne watched him go, feeling nothing but a distant sadness for the man he could have been if he had been brave enough to choose love over ambition, family over status, responsibility over selfishness. He had thrown away diamonds and ended up with ash, and that was exactly what he deserved. Chapter 7. The War for Money. Tom Hardy filed the lawsuit 6 weeks after being ejected from the Thornton mansion, and when the papers arrived via process server, Anne felt rage more than fear. The legal documents claimed Anne had deliberately hidden his children from him, deprived him of his parental rights for over 3 decades, and now that he had discovered their existence, he was entitled to establish a relationship and potentially claim a portion of any inheritance his biological daughters received from the Thornton estate as their legal guardian, despite their adult status. The lawsuit was transparently about money, barely bothering to dress up its mercenary intentions in the language of parental rights. And Anne sat in the library, reading the claims with Josephine and Lawrence beside her, while Delilah paced furiously, her attorney's mind already dissecting every weak point in Tom's case. "This is garbage," Delilah announced, throwing the papers down. "Complete garbage. He has no standing as a legal guardian for adult children. He has no claim to inheritance that comes through your bloodline, not his. And his entire argument about being denied parental rights collapses the moment I submit evidence that you attempted contact, and he refused it." "Do you have that evidence?" Lawrence asked. Anne nodded. "I kept copies of the returned letters, records of the unanswered calls. I was young and scared, but I was thorough, documenting everything in case he ever came back claiming I kept his children from him. I never imagined it would actually happen 3 decades later." Josephine placed a protective hand on Anne's shoulder. "We'll fight this together. The Thornton legal team is the best in the country, and we're not going to let this man terrorize you after everything he's already taken." The case dragged on for months, each hearing more brutal than the last. Tom's lawyers tried to paint Anne as vindictive, as a woman who deliberately kept children from their father out of spite, conveniently ignoring the timeline that showed his complete abandonment came before the pregnancy. They tried to claim Anne had a legal obligation to track him down and inform him regardless of his clearly expressed desire for no contact, as though his rejection of their marriage somehow did not extend to rejecting the consequences of their final night together. Delilah demolished their arguments with surgical precision, presenting evidence that painted a picture of Tom's wholesale abandonment. Returned letters, rejected calls, divorce papers that explicitly stated his desire for complete separation. She produced testimony from Anne's former landlords about evictions, from doctors about medical bills Anne could not pay, from teachers who helped Delilah and Ivy when their mother's resources were exhausted. She built a case that showed Tom Hardy had every opportunity to be involved and chose not to be, that his ignorance was willful and his absence was choice. The media coverage was relentless. Every news outlet ran stories about the case, debating whether Anne was justified in her silence, whether Tom deserved a second chance, whether money changed the moral calculus of family obligation. Anne found herself defending choices she made at 24 years old, broke and terrified and alone. explaining to strangers why she did not hunt down a man who made it clear he did not want her, why she chose to raise her daughters alone rather than beg for scraps from someone who had already proven he could discard her without remorse. Talk shows hosted panels where people who knew nothing about Anne's life dissected her decisions with an expertise born from ignorance. Some defended her fiercely, other single mothers who recognized the impossible position she had been in, women who understood that chasing a man who explicitly rejected you was not empowerment but desperation. Others condemned her, mostly men who thought biology trumped everything, who believed Tom's sperm entitled him to access regardless of his abandonment, who could not comprehend that fatherhood required more than genetics and a lawsuit filed 3 decades too late, and sat through depositions where Tom's lawyers asked invasive questions about her finances, her relationships, her parenting choices, trying to find any crack they could exploit. They asked why she never pursued child support, as though the answer was not obvious to anyone who had ever tried to extract money from someone who refused all contact. They asked why she did not use legal channels to establish paternity, as though she had the money for lawyers while working 3 jobs and barely surviving. They asked why she never told Delilah and Ivy about their father, as though telling children their father did not want them was preferable to simply not mentioning him at all. Through every hearing, every deposition, every media appearance, Josephine stood beside Anne like a shield, this mother who had lost her daughter for 32 years and now refused to let anyone hurt her again. The Thornton legal team, some of the most expensive and competent lawyers in the country, systematically dismantled Tom's case, proving he had no claim to Anne's inheritance because it came from her biological family and had nothing to do with their marriage, proving he had no automatic rights to relationships with adult daughters who explicitly stated they wanted nothing to do with him, proving his lawsuit was just extortion dressed in legal language. The trial itself was surreal, Anne sitting at a table with her legal team, while Tom sat across the aisle looking increasingly desperate as the evidence mounted against him. Delilah and Ivy both testified, their words calm and devastating, describing their childhood with clinical precision, the poverty, the struggle, their mother's sacrifices, and Tom's absolute absence from all of it. They made it clear they did not want a relationship with him, that his biological connection meant nothing compared to 31 years of abandonment, that they were testifying not because the court required it, but because they wanted him to hear from their own mouths exactly how little he mattered to them. The judge, a black woman in her 60s who had seen too many deadbeat fathers try to rewrite history, listened to everything with an expression that grew progressively colder. When both sides finally rested their cases and she delivered her ruling from the bench, her voice carried contempt that was barely professional. "Mr. Hardy, you abandoned your wife knowing she had no family support, no financial resources and no safety net. You explicitly rejected all contact with her, returned her letters, ignored her calls, and made it abundantly clear that you wanted no reminders of the life you were leaving behind. The fact that your ex-wife was pregnant at the time of this abandonment does not create retroactive obligations for her to track you down against your clearly expressed wishes. You had 31 years to wonder if your actions had consequences. You chose not to wonder. That choice is yours to live with, but it does not create legal rights now." The judge continued, her words precise and final. "You have no claim to Miss Anne's inheritance, which comes from her biological family and predates your marriage. You have no automatic rights to relationships with adult children who have explicitly stated they do not want contact with you. Your lawsuit is denied on all counts. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay Miss Anne's legal fees, and I am issuing a restraining order that prevents you from contacting her or her daughters without their explicit written consent. If you violate this order, you will be held in contempt. Do you understand?" Tom nodded mutely, his face grey, and Anne felt no triumph in his defeat, just exhaustion from months of reliving trauma that should have stayed buried. The restraining order should have ended it, should have given them peace. But Tom was desperate, and desperate men do desperate things. He went to the media with his story, appearing on any show that would have him, painting himself as a father kept from his children through no fault of his own. He cried on camera, claimed he had been denied the joy of watching his daughters grow, rewrote history to erase his cruelty and make himself the victim of Anne's vindictiveness. He conveniently forgot the returned letters, the ignored calls, the explicit rejection of all contact. He remembered only that he had daughters he never knew about and a fortune he could not access. And he framed those facts as tragedy rather than consequence. Anne watched the interviews with mounting fury, seeing Tom manipulate public opinion, seeing people who did not know the full story start to question whether maybe he deserved sympathy, whether maybe Anne had been wrong to keep silent. The comment sections filled with arguments, strangers debating her life, and Anne realized that Tom would never accept responsibility, would never acknowledge his role in his own destruction, would always find a way to blame someone else for the consequences of his choices. But public opinion shifted again when Delilah and Ivy gave their own interview, sitting together on a morning show, telling their story with calm precision. They described their childhood, their mother's sacrifices, their father's absence, and when the host asked if they ever wanted to meet Tom, Delilah looked directly into the camera and said with devastating clarity, "We already met him. He met us at a gala and felt nothing. He shook our hands and saw strangers. Biology is meaningless compared to the mother who raised us. And we will never have a relationship with a man who shows up 3 decades late looking for money instead of family." The interview went viral, and the tide of public opinion turned decisively. People saw Delilah and Ivy's confidence, their obvious love for their mother, their complete disinterest in the man who donated half their DNA, and they understood what Anne had been trying to explain all along. That fatherhood is earned through presence and love and sacrifice, not claimed through genetics and lawsuits and media manipulation. Tom disappeared from the public eye after that, his attempts at sympathy exhausted, his legal options depleted, his reputation destroyed, and heard through Lawrence's investigators that he was working a regular job, living in a small apartment, attending court-ordered therapy and slowly, painfully learning that some bridges once burned leave only ash behind. Chapter 8. The Weight of Truth. 6 months after the trial ended, Anne collapsed in the mansion library while reviewing foundation proposals with Josephine, her body simply giving out after months of stress and decades of survival mode, finally catching up to her all at once. The doctors at the hospital told her she was suffering from extreme exhaustion, malnutrition effects from years of poverty that had weakened her bones and immune system, and trauma-induced stress that had pushed her past the breaking point her stubbornness usually refused to acknowledge. Josephine sat beside Anne's hospital bed, holding her hand, while Delilah and Ivy stood on the other side, and Lawrence hovered near the door, looking uncharacteristically worried. Anne had always been the strong one, the survivor, the woman who kept moving forward no matter what life threw at her, and seeing her broken and fragile in a hospital gown made them all confront how much she had been holding together through sheer force of will. "I'm so tired," Anne whispered, tears streaming down her face for the first time since the trial ended. "I'm so tired of fighting, of surviving, of pretending to be strong when inside I'm still that foster kid who believed she was worthless because nobody wanted her." Josephine squeezed her hand. "You are wanted. You are loved. You are my daughter, and nothing will ever change that. But I spent 31 years believing I was abandoned," Anne sobbed. "I built my entire identity on being unwanted. And even now, even knowing the truth, that belief is carved so deep in me, I don't know how to dig it out. Tom left me because I wasn't enough. My birth parents, I thought you left me because I wasn't enough. And I raised Delilah and Ivy terrified every single day that I wouldn't be enough for them either, that I would fail them the way I believed everyone who ever touched my life failed me. Delilah climbed onto the hospital bed, careful of the IV lines, and wrapped her arms around her mother. You were always enough. You were everything. You gave us a childhood full of love, even when you were drowning in poverty. You taught us strength by example. You showed us that love doesn't require money or status or anything except showing up and being present and fighting for the people who matter. Ivy joined them on the bed, creating a cocoon of warmth around Anne. We never felt the absence of a father because your love took up all the space. You were both parents, Mom. You were our hero. And nothing Tom Hardy says or does will ever change that. Anne cried harder, years of suppressed emotion pouring out, and her family held her through it, letting her break apart because breaking apart was the only way to heal, letting her sob out 31 years of pain and fear and lonely determination that had kept her alive but had also nearly killed her. Over the next weeks, Anne began therapy with a psychologist who specialized in adoption trauma and complex PTSD. And slowly she started unpacking the layers of damage that Tom's abandonment had created on top of the foundational wound of being stolen from her biological family. She talked about foster care, about never having a permanent place, about learning that love was conditional and people were temporary. She talked about Tom, about how completely he had destroyed her sense of self-worth, about the years she spent believing she deserved nothing better than suffering. The therapist helped Anne understand that healing was not linear, that some wounds never fully closed, but instead became scars you learned to live with. That strength was not about never breaking, but about breaking and choosing to rebuild anyway. Anne learned to sit with her pain instead of running from it, to acknowledge her fear of abandonment without letting it control her, to slowly, tentatively begin believing that maybe, possibly, she deserved the love her family was offering. Delilah threw herself into work, using her anger at Tom and the entire legal system that had put her mother through months of trauma to fuel her practice defending people who could not defend themselves. She took on pro bono cases for single mothers facing custody battles, for women whose ex-partners weaponized the courts to continue abuse, for anyone who reminded her of Anne fighting alone against systems designed to crush people who started with nothing. Ivy channeled her pain into art, creating a series of paintings about mothers and daughters, about survival and sacrifice, about the different ways people define family. Her work appeared in galleries across the city, and critics praised the emotional depth, the raw honesty, the way her paintings made viewers confront uncomfortable truths about poverty and motherhood and the price women pay for men's failures. Lawrence surprised them all by becoming protective of Anne in ways that suggested he had finally stopped seeing her as a threat to his inheritance and started seeing her as his sister who had survived hell. He used his business connections to quietly destroy Tom's remaining reputation, ensuring that everyone who mattered knew exactly what kind of man Tom Hardy was, ensuring that no business would hire him, no bank would give him credit, no social circle would welcome him, using his wealth and power to deliver the kind of justice the courts could not provide. The media attention finally died down after the interview, where Delilah and Ivy made their position clear, and Anne was grateful for the return to privacy, for the ability to heal without cameras recording her every move. She started spending more time with Josephine, learning about the Thornton family history, discovering the grandfather she had never known who built the media empire from nothing, understanding the legacy she was now part of, even though she had missed 31 years of it. Josephine shared stories about Anne's infancy, about the terror of discovering her daughter missing from the nursery, about the immediate certainty that this was not a misplacement but a theft, about the decades spent searching while trying to maintain hope against impossible odds. She showed Anne the room she had kept prepared for 32 years, a bedroom designed for the daughter who never came home, updated periodically with age-appropriate furniture and decorations. A shrine to hope that bordered on obsession but had ultimately been vindicated. "I never gave up," Josephine said quietly, standing in the doorway of that never-used room. "Everyone told me to accept that you were gone, to have a memorial, to move on with my life. But I knew you were out there somewhere. I felt it in my bones, and I promised myself that if I ever found you, I would spend the rest of my life making up for the years we lost." Anne stood beside her mother, looking at the room that was supposed to have been hers. And for the first time since being found, she felt the full weight of what had been stolen from both of them. The childhood that should have been hers, the daughter Josephine should have raised. The 32 years they could never recover, no matter how much money or love they had now. "I'm angry," Anne admitted. "I'm so angry that some nurse I'll never know stole my entire life. That I grew up believing I was unwanted when you were desperate to find me. That Tom destroyed me because my foundational wound made me vulnerable to men who treated love like a transaction instead of a commitment." "You're allowed to be angry," Josephine said firmly. "You're allowed to rage at the unfairness of everything that happened to you. But Anne, you need to understand something. You survived. You took the worst possible circumstances, and you not only survived, you thrived. You raised two extraordinary daughters despite poverty that would have broken most people. You maintained your humanity despite everything trying to crush it. That's not luck or accident. That's strength and character and the kind of inner light that can't be extinguished no matter how dark things get." Anne wanted to believe her mother's words, wanted to see herself as strong instead of just stubborn, as brave instead of just too scared to give up. But the work of changing her self-perception was slow and painful and required confronting truths she had spent 3 decades avoiding. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon when Anne was walking through the mansion gardens and came across Delilah and Ivy having lunch on the terrace. They were laughing about something, their heads bent together the way they had done since childhood. And watching them, Anne felt something shift inside her chest, some fundamental understanding clicking into place. She had done that. She had created those women. She had taken the worst night of her life, that final desperate coupling with Tom Hardy, and from that pain she had brought forth 2 human beings who were kind and brilliant and strong. Tom's abandonment had tried to destroy her, but instead it had forced her to become both parents, to develop strength she never knew she possessed, to love with an intensity that had shaped Delilah and Ivy into people who knew they were valuable, regardless of circumstances or bank account balances. Anne joined her daughters on the terrace, and Ivy poured her tea while Delilah moved over to make space. And sitting there in the sunshine, surrounded by luxury that still felt surreal, Anne understood that healing did not mean forgetting or forgiving. It meant integration, taking all the broken pieces of who she had been and building something new that acknowledged the damage without being defined by it. "I love you both so much," Anne said quietly. "I know I don't say it enough, but you are the best thing I ever created, the only thing I did right when everything else was falling apart." "We know, Mom," Delilah said softly. "We've always known." And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Anne believed it. Chapter 9. The Reckoning Without Redemption. Spring arrived wet and cold, rain drumming against the mansion windows, while Anne sat in the library, reading through proposals for the charitable foundation Josephine wanted to establish in her name, focused on supporting single mothers and children in foster care. The work felt meaningful in ways Anne never imagined her life could feel meaningful, using the fortune she never earned to help people in situations she understood intimately, turning her suffering into something productive instead of just letting it sit inside her like poison. The knock on the library door interrupted her concentration, and Lawrence entered looking grim. "There's someone at the gate. Tom Hardy. He's asking to see you." And Anne, "He looks bad. Really bad." Anne's first instinct was to refuse, to have security send him away again, but something in Lawrence's expression stopped her. But how? Like he's given up on everything except this one last attempt. He's been standing in the rain for 2 hours, waiting for you to even consider talking to him. The guards say he's not drunk, not aggressive, just broken. Anne closed the proposal file. Let him in. Are you sure? No. But I think maybe I need to see him one more time to understand if the hate I've been carrying is still necessary or if I'm ready to set it down. They brought Tom to a small sitting room, not the grand library where previous confrontations had occurred, and Anne waited alone, having asked Josephine and Lawrence to stay nearby but out of sight. When Tom was shown in, dripping wet because he had refused an umbrella or coat from the guards, Anne barely recognized him. He had lost weight he could not afford to lose, his clothes hanging on a frame that looked skeletal, his face gaunt with suffering that went deeper than physical deprivation. The grey in his hair had spread completely, and his eyes carried the kind of emptiness that Anne recognized from her own mirror in the months after he left her. Tom stood in the doorway, water pooling at his feet, and did not try to come closer. Thank you for seeing me. I know I don't deserve even this much. You don't, Anne agreed. Sit down before you fall down. You look like you haven't eaten in weeks. Tom sat in the chair across from her, and the distance between them felt like an ocean made of all the years and pain they could never bridge. He stared at his hands, at the dirt under his nails, and the calluses from whatever work he was doing now, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet Anne had to lean forward to hear him. I'm not here to ask for anything. Not money, not forgiveness, not a relationship with Delilah and Ivy. I'm just here because I needed you to know that I understand now. I understand what I threw away. I understand that the poverty I experienced briefly is nothing compared to the poverty of spirit I've lived with since leaving you. I understand that success without love is just another form of failure. Anne listened without interrupting, giving him the courtesy of being heard, even though she owed him nothing. I destroyed the best thing in my life because I was too stupid to recognize its value, Tom continued, tears mixing with rainwater on his face. I destroyed you because I thought happiness was about money and status, instead of about being loved by someone who saw all my flaws and chose me anyway. And I'll spend whatever is left of my life knowing that I had everything and traded it for nothing. Is that what you came here to say? Anne asked quietly. That you finally figured out what I was worth after you threw me away? I came here to release you, Tom said. I've spent months in therapy learning that my narcissism destroyed us, that my inability to value anything I couldn't monetize made me treat you like you were disposable when you were actually irreplaceable. I came to tell you that you were right about everything, that I was cruel and selfish and too damaged to deserve the love you gave me. I came to tell you that the failure of our marriage was my failure alone, and I'm sorry I made you believe otherwise. Anne felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Your apology doesn't change anything. It doesn't give me back the years I spent believing I was worthless. It doesn't erase Delilah and Ivy's childhood poverty. It doesn't undo the damage you did. I know, Tom said. I'm not apologizing to be forgiven. I'm apologizing because you deserve to hear that none of it was your fault, that you were always enough, that my leaving had everything to do with my brokenness and nothing to do with your value. They sat in silence, two people who had once promised forever now, strangers connected only by shared history and shared damage, and looked at this man who had nearly destroyed her and felt the hate she'd been carrying start to loosen its grip. Not because he earned forgiveness, but because carrying hate was exhausting, and she was tired of letting him take up space in her emotional life. I don't forgive you, Anne said carefully. Forgiveness would require caring enough about your suffering to want to relieve it, and I don't care anymore. Tom, you're just a man I used to know. a man who hurt me badly, and I'm done letting that hurt define me. That's fair, Tom said quietly. More than fair. Can I ask about them? About our daughters? They're not our daughters. They're my daughters, and they're doing brilliantly without you, which is exactly what you deserve to live with knowing. Tom nodded, accepting the boundary. I won't try to contact them again. I won't try to contact you again after today. I just needed you to know that I see clearly now, even though the clarity came too late to matter. He stood to leave, and Anne found herself speaking again. Tom, do you remember what you said to me in the courthouse parking lot? That you'd die alone and broke, Tom said, his voice thick with shame. The cruelest thing I've ever said to anyone. I've thought about those words every single day since you spoke them. They lived in my head like a curse, like a prophecy I was powerless to escape. But you were wrong. I'm not alone. I have daughters who love me, a mother who searched for me for 32 years, a brother who became protective, a family who chose me. And I'm not broke. I'm wealthier than you ever dreamed of being. So your curse failed, Tom. You predicted my destruction, and instead I found salvation. I'm glad, Tom said, and surprisingly, he sounded like he meant it. I'm glad you survived me. I'm glad you found family. I'm glad my worst wish for you didn't come true. Anne walked him to the door, and as he stepped back into the rain, she called after him one last time. Tom, get help, real help. Not just for the girls you'll never know, but for yourself, because living with that much regret will eat you alive if you let it. He turned back, rain streaming down his face. Goodbye, Anne. Thank you for being the kind of person who still has compassion for someone who showed you none. Anne watched him walk away, watched security escort him back to the gates, and when he disappeared from view, she closed the door and leaned against it, feeling lighter than she had in months, despite the heavy conversation. Josephine appeared from the library, having heard everything, and pulled Anne into a hug. I'm proud of you, Josephine said. That took strength. It took letting go, Anne corrected. I've been holding on to anger because it felt like the only power I had over him. But watching him broken like that, I realized the anger was just hurting me. He's already destroyed. I don't need to keep destroying him. Lawrence appeared with Delilah and Ivy, both of whom had been listening from the next room, ready to intervene if Tom became aggressive. Delilah looked at her mother with newfound respect. You gave him more grace than he deserved. I gave him closure so I could have closure, Anne said. His suffering doesn't make me happy. It just makes me sad for who we both could have been if he'd been brave enough to choose love over ambition. But that's his loss to carry, not mine. That night Anne slept better than she had in years, and when she woke the next morning, she understood that healing was not about forgetting or forgiving. It was about integration and release, about taking the broken pieces of your past and deciding they no longer got to control your future. Chapter 10. The Freedom in Letting Go. Anne's birthday arrived on a morning painted gold with autumn light, and she woke in the mansion bedroom that finally felt like hers, instead of borrowed space, surrounded by family who had gathered to celebrate not just her birth, but her survival, her strength, her journey from discarded foster child to found daughter to woman who rebuilt herself from ashes. Tom Hardy thought he had scattered beyond recovery. Josephine had planned an intimate celebration. Just family, no cameras or media attention, just the people who mattered most, sitting together in gratitude for the miracle that brought Anne home after 3 decades lost. Breakfast was served in the conservatory, sunlight streaming through glass walls while they ate and laughed and told stories about the year that had passed since Anne's discovery. After the meal, Delilah and Ivy exchanged meaningful glances and pulled out a wrapped package they presented to their mother with ceremony that suggested its contents mattered beyond typical birthday gifts. Anne unwrapped it carefully, her hands trembling slightly, and inside found a bound book with a cover illustration so beautiful it made her breath catch. The title, written in Ivy's elegant script, read, "The Woman Who Survived Everything." Below it, A painting showed a woman standing at the edge of dawn, her back to darkness, her face turned toward light. And while the woman's features were deliberately indistinct, Anne recognized herself in the figure's posture, in the determination radiating from the painted form. "We wrote it together," Delilah explained as Anne opened the book with shaking hands. "I did the words. Ivy did the illustrations. It's your story, Mom. Our story. The truth about what you survived and what you built from nothing." Anne began reading, tears streaming down her face as she encountered her own life transformed into narrative. Delilah had written with brutal honesty about the poverty they survived, about watching their mother work herself to exhaustion, about the love that sustained them through circumstances that should have broken them. But she had also written about triumph, about resilience, about the way Anne's refusal to give up had shaped her daughters into women who knew their worth regardless of circumstances. Ivy's illustrations brought the story to life, paintings of tiny apartments and enormous love, of a mother's hands worn from work but gentle in comfort, of two little girls who never understood how close to the edge they lived, because their mother's strength made poverty feel like adventure instead of tragedy. The final pages dealt with Anne's discovery, with the reunion that changed everything, and Delilah's words landed like revelation. "Our mother spent 31 years believing she was abandoned, building her identity on the foundation of being unwanted. But she was never unwanted. She was desperately sought, desperately mourned, desperately loved by a woman who refused to stop searching. And when the truth emerged, when Anne discovered she was not disposable but stolen, not worthless but priceless, she had to rebuild her entire sense of self." The last illustration showed 4 women standing together, multiple generations connected by blood and choice. And beneath it, Ivy had written in careful script, "Family is not just who raises you. It is also who searches for you, who fights for you, who refuses to let you disappear. Family is the love that survives time and distance and every force that tries to break it." Anne closed the book and pulled her daughters close, unable to speak through the tears, and Josephine joined them, wrapping her arms around all 3 women, and Lawrence stood nearby looking suspiciously emotional for a man who prided himself on control. "This is the most precious gift anyone has ever given me," Anne finally managed. "You took my pain and transformed it into something beautiful, something that honors not just my survival, but the love that made survival worthwhile." "You did that yourself, Mom," Ivy said softly. "We just recorded the truth." That afternoon, after the celebration concluded and family members departed, Anne found herself alone in the library, holding the book her daughters created, reading through it again, seeing her life reflected back to her not as tragedy, but as testimony, not as damage, but as strength forged in fire that should have destroyed her, but instead tempered her into something unbreakable. She thought about Tom Hardy, about the man he used to be and the man he had become, and she felt no triumph in his suffering, no satisfaction in his regret. She felt only freedom, the freedom that came from releasing anger, from understanding that his cruelty revealed his brokenness, not her worthlessness, from choosing to build her future on the foundation of who she actually was, instead of who his abandonment tried to tell her she was. Anne thought about Josephine's 32-year search, about the obsessive hope that had driven her mother to donate blood monthly in facilities across the country, creating a genetic net designed to catch her missing daughter if she ever needed medical intervention. That kind of love, persistent and unrelenting, had rewritten Anne's entire history, transformed abandonment into abduction, replaced the narrative of being unwanted with the truth of being desperately sought. She thought about Delilah and Ivy, these magnificent women who carried Tom's genes but none of his character, who had survived poverty without becoming bitter, who had watched their mother struggle without losing respect for her, who had built successful lives not despite their difficult childhood, but because their difficult childhood taught them what truly mattered. taught them that love was more valuable than money, that presence was more meaningful than presence, that showing up was the foundation of every relationship worth maintaining. That evening, as twilight painted the mansion gardens in shades of purple and gold, Anne walked outside and found Josephine sitting on a bench overlooking the rose garden. She sat beside her mother, and they remained silent for long minutes, just existing together in shared space, mother and daughter finally reunited after 3 decades apart. "Do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if I hadn't been stolen?" Anne asked quietly. Josephine considered the question carefully. "Every day for 32 years, I wondered. I imagined the childhood you should have had, the security you deserved, the love I was denied the chance to give you. But Anne, watching who you became despite everything, watching the strength you developed through adversity, watching the way you loved your daughters with an intensity born from knowing what it feels like to be alone, I think maybe you became someone extraordinary precisely because you survived something terrible. That doesn't make the terrible things acceptable," Anne said. "No," Josephine agreed. "It doesn't, but it means your suffering wasn't meaningless. You transformed pain into purpose, trauma into strength, abandonment into the kind of love that saved your daughters from ever feeling what you felt. That's alchemy, Anne. That's taking lead and creating gold." Anne leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, feeling safe in ways she had never felt safe before, and understanding that healing was not linear, that some days she would still wake up feeling like that foster kid who believed she was worthless. But those days would become less frequent as she slowly, carefully rebuilt her sense of self on the foundation of truth instead of lies Tom Hardy had told her. Delilah and Ivy found them in the garden as darkness fell, and the 4 women sat together, watching stars emerge one by one. Each point of light a reminder that even in darkness, beauty persisted, hope survived, love endured. "I keep thinking about Tom," Anne admitted, "about whether he'll ever actually heal or if he'll just carry regret until it consumes him completely." "That's not your responsibility," Delilah said firmly. "His healing is his work, not yours. You spent too many years taking responsibility for his happiness, sacrificing yourself trying to be enough for someone who was incapable of recognizing value. You don't owe him your compassion now." "I know," Anne said, "but I also know what it's like to live with self-hatred, to believe you're fundamentally unlovable, to wake up every day feeling like an imposter in your own life. I don't want that for anyone, even him." "That's why you're extraordinary," Ivy said softly. "Because even after everything he did, you can still see his humanity, can still want healing for him even though his healing has nothing to do with you anymore." They sat in the garden until cold drove them inside, and Anne understood that this was what family meant. Not perfection or constant happiness or the absence of pain, but presence, commitment. The willingness to sit together in darkness and wait for stars. The choice to love even when love was complicated, even when love required courage, even when love meant holding space for someone else's healing while protecting your own. The book Delilah and Ivy created became Anne's most treasured possession, not because it told a story she had forgotten, but because it reflected her life back to her through the eyes of people who loved her, who saw strength where she saw survival, who recognized triumph where she felt only tired, who understood that the woman who survived everything was not the same as the woman who had nothing left to lose. Anne kept the book on her nightstand, and sometimes before sleeping she would open it randomly, reading paragraphs that reminded her who she was beneath the trauma, beneath the years of believing Tom's assessment of her worthlessness, beneath the foundational wound of growing up believing she was abandoned when she was actually stolen. And slowly, page by page, day by day, Anne began believing the story her daughters told, began seeing herself as strong instead of just stubborn, as brave instead of just too scared to quit, as worthy of love not because she earned it through suffering, but because she existed Because she was Josephine's daughter, and Delilah and Ivy's mother, and Lawrence's sister and her own complete self. Valuable without condition, deserving without qualification. Enough exactly as she was. Tom Hardy faded into memory. His ghost finally released from the haunted spaces of Anne's heart. And while she did not forgive him, she also stopped allowing him to define her. His cruelty had tried to destroy her, but instead it had forced her to discover strength she never knew she possessed, to develop resilience that carried her through decades of struggle, to love her daughters with an intensity that ensured they never felt the abandonment she had felt. And that, Anne finally understood, was her true inheritance. Not the Thornton billions or the mansion or the media empire, but the unbreakable bond between mother and daughters. The love that survived poverty and pain and every force that tried to break it. The proof that Tom Hardy had taken everything from her except the only things that actually mattered. Her capacity to love, her determination to survive, and her unwavering belief that tomorrow could be better than today if she was willing to fight for it. Anne's story did not end with forgiveness or reconciliation, or any neat resolution that tied trauma into tidy packages. It ended with acceptance, with integration, with the understanding that she was both the woman who survived terrible things and the woman who built beautiful things from the wreckage. That her past was part of her but did not define her. That Tom Hardy's assessment of her worth had been wrong from the beginning and remained wrong at the end. She was not the woman who would die alone and broke. She was the woman who survived everything and emerged surrounded by love, held by family, filled with purpose, and finally, blessedly, completely free.